After the battle, it was a trick to actually get everybody coordinated, to actually go down and reunite with their family and friends. Everyone simply wanted to go straight down to the planet, but you can't all go into the two remaining runways that are still active. And you can't just show up. You might get shot at. Not everyone knows that we're friendly. Not everyone has the IFF code. So I volunteered to go down first and let them know all the codes and make sure that they understood who was who, as if they weren't watching. Soon I was coming in for a landing. The Zells were holding on, as entering an atmosphere is not so fun in a type of aerospace fighter, especially one this size. It shook the living crap out of them, almost literally in one case. But eventually we came in and glided towards our final destination. They flanked us on both sides with fighters. I didn't think they had any left, but sure enough, there's an F-15 on one side and an F-22 on the other. I waved at both of them, and they waved back. I was actually surprised to see what I was seeing. But hey, maybe they didn't try to kill us all off anyway. Maybe they were just after the resources of the planet. At least I can hope for that. But then again, after seeing what I've seen, I don't put anything past those Xeno bastards. Present company excluded, of course, as I thought about that and looked over to my Zell friends. We came in for a landing. Thankfully, this thing is more of a VTOL than anything else. I just had a little trouble activating the zero-gravity motors, just because, well, I had not exactly got out of that battle unscathed. As I was still plugged into the machine itself, I could actually see that the whole system was beginning to strain under the weight. I forgot that gravity has almost twice the weight of everyone else. However, the anti-grav motors would usually do the job, but the one on my starboard side was about to just give out. So I got down to the ground as fast as I could. The landing wasn't exactly smooth, and we landed with a bit of a thud, but it was better than having the grav motor fail on me and all of a sudden the whole thing just flip ass over tea kettle sideways and me going crashing into the ground. As soon as we got there, immediately they started bringing all sorts of men and machines out and started pointing weapons at us. I got on the radio and I got a hold of the tower. Hey, let them know we're friendly. We're friendly. I'm not here to shoot anybody. You mind turning that 50 somewhere else? Yeah, Roger, one moment. And over the PA system, all forces, stand down. That is a friendly unit. I say again, all forces stand down. That is a friendly. This made everyone in the base look at me strange, but they did eventually lower their weapons as I stood inside the bridge and waved at them. Hey, look at me, I'm human. They couldn't hear me, of course, but eventually I went down to the cargo bay. I had to lower the ship a little bit, which surprised the crap out of them because the ship actually is supposed to lay on its belly. This is not what you would consider a standard cargo vessel. Cargo vessels, you can release cargo from any different direction. It doesn't matter. This one was not designed for that. There's no umbilicals. There's no elevators. There's none of that fancy crap. It's simply hatch doors. That's it. That's it. All it is the doors that open up. I went to the main hatch and I actually knocked on it. I gave them a quick SOS on the other side so they wouldn't shoot me. Of course, that's the only Morse code that I actually know. And then I opened up the door itself. I wasn't surprised the fact that I'm looking down the barrel of multiple M4s and a couple of saws of maybe a 50 cal and a Mark 19 way in the back. I'm just like, okay, guys. I just slowly put my hands up and said, hey, didn't the tower just tell you to stand down, you dumbasses? They all looked at me and goes, okay, I guess he does talk like a soldier. Most of them lowered their weapons and walked up. I stepped out and go, okay, who's your CO? Who's in charge? A man walked up and introduced himself. Hey, Sergeant Major Vanskoy, how you doing? I shook his hand. Not too bad, Sergeant Major, but you mind telling these guys to relax? I got some friends on this ship. I do not need shot. Sergeant Major, look, you have other humans that survive? No, my crew isn't exactly human, but they're not a threat. The Sergeant Major looked over, and he could see one of the Zell's little ears sticking out on one side. I was like, oh crap. As I stepped back and I waved them forward, I also waved with my other hand for everyone else to calm down. The Zels stepped out, and everyone just kind of looked and went, "Aw, they're so cute." Of course, they only come up to about waist high. The tallest one is only about an inch above my waistline, and I'm 6 foot. Still, given the sight of these guys, everyone kind of looked at them. "Oh, look, little space trolls. How cute." Whatever. Didn't really give a shit at that point. I simply looked at the sergeant major and said, "You mind telling the rest of those guys, weapons out, not towards me? Thank you." He turned and cursed them out, and they turned their weapons down, and a few of their recovery team came up. I simply said, "Sergeant Major, we need to talk. We got a lot of people up in space. They got to come down. They want to see their friends and family as soon as possible. They also want to bring a whole bunch of tech, and we definitely need to talk about security on this planet." He looked at me with that same Sergeant Major grin of, "Okay, let's get some work done." With that, we walked inside, and I was introduced to their chain of command. I only had 2 Zels with me. They flanked on my right and left. The rest of them stayed around the ship and were being greeted by the rest of the soldiers. To my surprise, they didn't seem to be aggressive towards the Zels. The Zels were, as they said, kind of cute to look at, and they were a very friendly species. I was ushered in with my 2 compatriots to talk to the commander, and immediately we got down to work. I said, "Sir, look, we have a lot of people up there. They're in different ships. They're still coming in, and they're going to want to come down to this planet really quick. Do you have any other bases besides this one?" He shook his head and said, "This is all we got left. We're going to have to deal with it." "Affirmative, sir. I can communicate with each of them up in space, but you don't have the technology here to do so." He looked at me confused, and then I explained the neural implant that was inside my head, and that's how I could control the ship so well. In actuality, 3 or 4 people plugged into a destroyer, and you can run that entire damn ship. He looked absolutely amazed at this level of technology. "Look, sir, I'll gladly share this, but we got to get those folks down, minus about 4 or 5 ships, and we got a lot of salvage up there that needs to be taken care of, like now." With that, we got to work. We immediately got as many folks down as possible, loading them onto cargo vessels and bringing them down towards the airfield. Thankfully, every single one of the ship was also designed for atmospheric flight, mainly using anti-gravity motors to make sure they stay aloft. There were only 4 other ships besides mine that actually had any type of wings to them, and mine were not exactly designed to give lift. They were actually designed to have more cargo space, actually, so that you could hang things off of them. However, it wasn't long before I was asking folks to strap on some pylons so that I could strap on more missiles. The missiles I had were good, but they were limited. I immediately got busy pulling some out. The Zels were busy making sure the ship was back in tip-top shape. The engineers were completely amazed with the way the missile was designed. In actuality, it was very similar to some of the things that they were working on. I think they call them Pack 3s, but these were a lot smaller and the munitions were much, much tighter packed. However, they started looking at the type of munitions being used, and I swear those engineers are some evil geniuses, but I'll get into that one later. Eventually, I was able to hook up my ship to one of their computers so that I could download all the schematics they would need for the ships, the weapons, the engines, and stuff like that. However, one of the biggest things we were looking at, especially when the rest of the engineers that had survived being out in space got to the ground, was the fabrication units. These fabrication units, once constructed, would be able to build one of the ships that I was flying in about 28 hours. That is absolutely insane. And with all the modifications I've done, you have to strap on another 3.5 hours so that it can perform all its extras. You see, when you're in space and you've got nothing to do, humans get bored and we tend to tinker with things. And yes, those pulse lasers turned out to be far more effective than the solid ones. However, there was still some bonuses to the solid laser, which we talked about before. I spent my days going from briefing room to briefing room to briefing room, going over different schematics, going over different technologies, going over the history, going over different anatomy of these aliens. I started to worry what the biochemists were going to do, but then again, evil geniuses. But one of the things we had to work on above everything else was getting more ships so we could salvage what was still floating in space. It may take weeks to get here from that space station, but that was not the closest area to us. In actuality, we figured at best we had 3 weeks. 3 weeks, and that includes the time it took me to fly here. 3 weeks, and they're going to figure out what's going on. And 3 weeks, we're going to have company. But that's not even counting the civilian groups that has sent pirates to start capturing people and capturing all sorts of minerals. We found out what the aliens had done is they targeted the planet and strip mined it for certain things. Most, if not all, the titanium on the planet is gone. It's just gone. Most of the gold as well. You would think, why are they going to do? What are they going to do? Buy something with it? No, in actuality, gold is still one of the greatest conductors, and it's used for most, if not all, of the wiring in a lot of these ships. However, with the fabrication unit, gold was almost inconsequential. It's just easier to work with on the machine if you can get the right materials. The fabrication machines, we absolutely busted our butts to get built. Thankfully, we got the first one up and running, and it could build a ship about the size of a large van in, again, about 20 to 24 hours. However, there were no bells and whistles, no ports, no weapons, no nothing. And the engines worked, but I mean, you're talking bare bones design here. With that, we used it to start building the parts so that we can make a larger fabricator, and larger and larger. While this was going on, I used my ship to go into space and help to salvage those that were out there. Unfortunately for us, we also had to clear the ships that were currently adrift. Though adrift, they still had just enough life support systems to maintain part of the crew. I found out the dreadnought that I had blown its belly out, I hadn't actually hit the engine compartment. I had actually severed the bridge. That flash of light was actually one of the power conduits fricasseeing everybody inside the bridge. We found the captain still stuck in a weird pose, as it seemed as though he had just been zapped into place. Think Pompeii and you get a good idea. The one destroyer we had was still on patrol. We were hoping to get more ships out of what was left, but unfortunately our guys did too good of a job to start tearing them apart. The dreadnought that tried to survive on its way down, unfortunately, was now a monument stuck in the earth. Well, I don't want to say stuck in the earth, as when it landed ass first, and it crushed itself about 30%. It still was sticking bow facing towards the sky, but eventually we're going to have to send scrappers down here and tear it apart. It has materials in here that we're going to need. Securing the battleship was not something I was used to. I know how to clear a room, but clearing a room in zero gravity is a whole another animal entirely, especially when working in a vacuum. I saw many men end up choking to death as their suits became compromised. And sometimes there's nothing you can do about it. But eventually we did clear the dreadnought. And we looked at its design and we found out, guess what? It's an incredibly simple design. It's not compartmentalized nearly as much as we would expect it to be. Not even close. We look at all the honeycomb designs that we have, all the different compartments we have on our sea-based battleships, and they make this thing look like a shoebox. It's all open. It's no wonder a few decent hits took this thing down. The hell were they thinking? It wasn't long until I was able to look inside the schematics of the bridge. Thankfully, there was still a connector in there in the secondary bridge that still worked. Turns out that this was one of their rushed models. In most space combat, numbers matter more than, well, staying alive, I guess. they decided that they would make a much faster battleship. A faster, more maneuverable, and with a lot of heavy guns. But honestly, there was armor on here that was so damn thin. And all I could think of is, you idiots definitely didn't look into our history. The Hood had this same problem. No wonder it couldn't stick up with a Bismarck. Going on, our battleships would definitely be much sturdier than this. Human battleships have always been better than this. Thankfully, we were able to salvage not one, but two of the destroyers we had taken out as well. Thankfully, some of the ships that we had taken from the space station were actually set up to repair these ships. And good thing too, because just before we had got the Dreadnought up and running, the first of the alien ships had shown up. They were looking for the rest of their group. They began to hail everybody, but with no response, they just got closer and closer and closer. Pretty soon, it was to the point where we could use our short-range weapons and just take this thing out. But instead, somebody had a better idea. They had swung the destroyer around and flipped it so that it was just on the dorsal aft section and locked its main guns on it, and then ordered the carrier, when I say carrier, I mean cargo carrier, to stand down. They were confused, but immediately listened because there was no way out. They couldn't jump to any type of FTL. They were facing the planet. They would have to arc their ship if they wanted to do that. And if they moved any wrong way, the destroyer was going to vaporize them with its main guns. When they stood down, we took the ship. And inside, I was surprised to see many more of the lizard and alien types that were there. These self-righteous pricks were something that just made me angry. Now, we may be still human, but I will say, even though we delivered them down to a POW camp, they might not have been completely undamaged. What can I say? They fell down the stairs in zero gravity. Regardless of that, most of us worked for days without sleep to get as many defenses ready, to get as many ships recovered as soon as possible, and try to get them marked in our colors. One of the first things to change was the IFF code. But another thing that changed was something I didn't think the rest of the humans would want to do. They all got the internal implant. The implant that goes into your brain. And now they can run a ship almost by themselves. Now, the ship I'm in isn't much bigger than a large house. However, it's difficult sometimes for one person to operate all the systems at once. Sometimes you end up focusing too much and one of the systems will actually shut down. It's a strange thing, but hey, the human mind does what the human mind does. They would get past this by having an actual crew on board. And they would need additional personnel to take care of basic necessities, of course. Things like food, maintenance, and that sort of thing. We weren't going to rely on robots. No. We don't have the ability to do that. At least, not yet. While this was going on, I received a bit of a shock. I was requested back down onto the planet because they wanted to inspect my ship for something. I asked them if something was wrong, and they said, no, we want to see if yours is the best design that we can use. I kind of laughed a little bit and was a little smug at the idea, since I did in fact choose the best small ship that I could find when we did leave the space station. So of course I headed down, and again, I swear these guys in the fighters just love racing us down through the atmosphere. So this time I was flanked by two F-15s, and they just kind of looked at me and gave me a wave. I was like, okay, whatever, dude. Then they started dancing around me, and one got behind me, made me a little nervous. I really don't like it when a fighter jet is beneath me as I'm trying to come in for a landing. Had to get on the radio and ask him, dude, what the hell do you think you're doing? Oh, we're just escorting you. Yeah, bullshit. Get out from behind me. You're making me nervous. I don't need you back there priming your missile while you're finger fucking the trigger. With that, he pulled off to the side, but I swear, even though his mask was on, I thought I saw him laughing, along with his wingman. Eventually, I got down onto the ground near one of the fabricators, and they began to wave me in. They wanted me to enter the fabricator. So, of course, I'm on the comms. You want to tell me why this guy's trying to wave me into something that's going to dismantle my ship with me in it? Oh, no one told you. One moment. With that, I immediately settled the ship. I didn't care who was waving me where. I settled the ship on the ground and waited for the comms officer to report to me. To my surprise, it was the commander. Yeah, Captain, we're going to upgrade your ship. What do you mean upgrade? I asked him. Yeah, we have some additional upgrades. You wanted the pylons with the extra missiles, and we got some extra ordnance for you. Okay, before you touch my ship, I'm coming in to see what the hell you're about to do. With that, I opened up the dock and I had my crew stand by while I went out and talked to them. Come to find out, they weren't kidding. They did want to upgrade it. But to do so, they basically had to strip it down to its frame. Somehow, these wonderful engineers, once they got the implant and they could actually look through all the different schematics of all these different ships, to include military ships since we had taken over their dreadnoughts, all the schematics were on board. These guys do what they do best. They were going to upgrade the engines. They were going to upgrade the sensors. They were going to upgrade everything. But to do so, again, they had to basically let the nanomachines tear the ship apart and rebuild it. I looked at him and said, no, you're not tearing my ship apart unless I decide how this ship is going to be designed. And with that, I went and talked to the engineers. It took about an hour, and of course I had to get input from my crew. But it wasn't long before we figured out the best way to actually operate it, and the best way to get everything set up. Instead of the single solid energy weapon and 2 pulse weapons, instead we had 4 different pulse weapons, each of them with their own cooling system attached, so that if one fails, all 4 don't fail. Along with that, we had several different missile launchers attached. Not only did I have an additional 2 tubes attached, but the pylons were attached as well. For the time being, I wouldn't have any extra ordnance hanging off it, as it makes it a little bit more cumbersome to fly, at least in atmosphere. The wings themselves were sloped a little bit, and they changed the pitch along with a little bit of the shape, so that did give me more lift and a bit more control inside the atmosphere. I had a retractable tail as well that would allow me to control things better once I got in atmosphere. The stabilizer rockets were updated, and everything else was completely upgraded. In truth, they were dismantling this ship and using it to make new parts and a new ship entirely. I was almost grinning, though a little sad, when I saw the ship being slowly taken apart. So that you understand how the fabricator works, it sends frequencies, certain frequencies, once it figures out what's metal, to break them apart to its base elements. You can do this with water with a certain frequency and break hydrogen and oxygen apart, and you simply have the 2 different gases. It's the same process, but each of these molecules is then collected, it goes through, it's sorted, and then using another frequency, they can use these same particles to reattach, redesign, and put together a brand new ship, or a brand new vehicle, or whatever you might fancy. The kicker is you do need the raw materials, and the closer you have to the original material, the better off you are. In actuality, it doesn't take much for this thing. Say it needs a tungsten core as its keel. Then if you can get it a solid tungsten rod, it doesn't have to go through as much work to break down everything down to its base elements and then reconstruct it from scratch. Instead, it will simply break it down to its original elements and then just reform it in a different shape. Such wonderful technology. Of course, it does put a lot of our manufacturing out of business, and you can't make food out of it unless you put food into it. but we didn't care at this point. All I knew is as that sucker was rolled out to me, I'm looking at a brand new ship of my own design, and it was beautiful. It was basically a long-range fighter craft, and I was all smiles. My crew was also very happy, to the point where they're actually jumping up and down for joy. I had to grab one and pat her on the head to get her to calm down. As she was about to rip my belt off, she was so happy as she grabbed onto me and was just jumping. Oh, looky. Okay, calm, easy. We'll get a tour here in a minute. I took the maiden voyage inside this ship, and it did fly much better. To my complete astonishment, this would become the standard fighter that we would use, as it only took another 39.2 hours to build one through a single fabricator. And they were constructing fabricators extremely fast. At one point, they could pump out 30 of these ships in a single day, as long as we had enough materials to feed the fabricators. This was a recommendation that was very well received. We may have a single dreadnought, we may have a couple of destroyers, which is great, but we do not have the ability to build a bunch of them. And if the aliens come knocking, we need something to throw at them. And sometimes quantity is quality. However, when it comes to humans, all I can say is, why not both? With that, I was actually put in charge of most of the fleet. Those that had a ship similar to mine, we gave them the designation number 303. Why? Well, if you know your history, you know why, as 303 was also painted in red and white numbers. A few people were confused on this, being that I'm not exactly European, I'm American. But I looked at them and said, hey, you can't forget your history. They didn't fight this much. Eventually, each of the new ships will be given a new designation. However, this one will be Foxtrot 303. And it was a good thing we had so many of them, because more and more of the civilian freighters began to show up. But fairly soon, as I was doing my patrol, on the other side of the planet, something jumped in. Something real big. My sensors were going absolutely crazy as it woke me up from a sleep. I ran to the captain's chair, throwing myself in, strapping down real quick, and immediately started scanning to see what was going on. It was another dreadnought, but this one was of a completely different design. This one was here for business, not pleasure. There were no communications, no hails, no nothing coming out. And as I got ready to make a jump to the other side of the planet, I could tell by the sensors this thing was beginning to target any ship in the area. Oh, shit. What they were not expecting was the 303s to jump in. When we jumped in, it was, as the man says, all guns blazing. We targeted the turrets as best we could, and then fired all our ordnance. The ship began to fire all its weapons in our direction. We had to duck and weave from the distances we were at to try and dodge the projectile weapons, which you can do if you're far enough away, but this ship was not stopping. It was making a beeline straight towards the planet. They were not expecting our dreadnought to come from the western hemisphere and just come around the planet and begin to fire towards it. By the time they realized that another dreadnought had fired on them, it was too late and they had taken a broadside. Unfortunately for us, this thing was much better built. It tanked those hits, even though we could see massive holes in the hull, but it was still functional. It turned its turrets towards ours and fired as well. Thankfully for this, it gave us another opportunity for another strafing run and another volley. What we worried about was this was going to actually make it to the planet and be able to fire on our base, our few that remained. But what they did not truly expect was the sheer rage and the no fucks given of humans. we would be coming in, and I saw several of the 303s come through. And as they fired, they unleashed all their weapons, everything they had, every missile. The automatic launch tubes would fire one right after another. Any ordnance that was hanging off their wings was immediately launched towards the dreadnought as it kept going in. And as the dreadnought's weapons came up and fired on it, if it damaged the 303 and the 303 couldn't bank off, you just saw its engines crank up, and it slammed into the side of that ship with reckless abandonment. As you could see, with every hit, the ship shuddered, even though its large mass was able to take many hits, and most of the turret rounds that it was being hit with were designed to pierce, not to strike hard. It was still rocking the ship left and right. I can only imagine what the crew inside was feeling as they were bounced off the bulkheads. As I came around for another pass, I could actually hear one of my crewmen screaming, "Another one, another one, another one, another one, another one, another one." I'm like, oh shit, another one what? I looked out the side, and that wasn't alien. What the hell? And with that, this thing fired not one, but two main guns, each of them blasting into the side of the alien dreadnought and just slicing through its armor plating. Even though the beams could only be fired for about a second or two, it was enough to get the job done. One of the beams must have hit any type of power conduit or maybe even the engines, as the battleship, the dreadnought itself, exploded, blowing a massive part of the ship off into the middle of space. And with that, everything went silent. Screaming over the comms, I told everybody to stand down, stand down, stand down. Looks like they're adrift. Take up positions. If they turn one turret, we're going to blast them into nothing. We all got in positions around the dreadnought, and we waited. We made sure we were far enough out in case they decided to get a little froggy and use their self-destruct system. We wouldn't get caught up in the blast. But it wouldn't be anything for me to simply give the command and have all my pulse lasers go right through the engine compartment. But nothing. It was just there. I had to sit and watch, along with many, as the bodies of the crew simply drifted out into space. Boxes of cargo, parts of the ship itself, bulkheads, hull, even looked like an alien latrine was kind of floating out into space. I guess that shot had vented everything. And with that, I turned and looked. What in the hell? I knew they were constructing the other ones, but when the hell did they build this thing? Apparently, somebody had been building something much larger than I had been told. However, I wasn't complaining. We would find out later that that was a prototype, and those cannons actually burned themselves out after that first shot, and the whole ship had to be decommissioned, which was horrible considering it had probably just saved our asses. Part of its hull would be set up in the base in a place of honor to show that the ship itself had been around and to know its story. But while that was going on, we simply waited for any other movement to happen. We kept scanning the ship over and over and over again, but nothing. Eventually, we sent the scrapper drones in, and it began to look through the entire ship. They found no crew alive, which was a shame. We didn't want to kill them all. Oh, wait. Yes, we did. But we now looked at our new prize, and all I could think of is, can we even salvage that?